Welcome everyone. Let me introduce myself. My name's Dr. Rob Higgins. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Thompson Rivers University. And before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that Thompson Rivers University sits within the traditional unceded territory of the Kamloops Tashaquepnik within the Secwepemc Ulu. What I want to talk to you about today are my research interests. I'm what's known as a myrmecologist, which most people would not understand. I'm an entomologist. I work with insects, but quite specifically my interests are focused on ants. And I thought that I would sort of start today's video from my own backyard because ants, can be found everywhere. I have colonies of Formica neoclara and Phoenicaster occidentalis and Formica revita, sort of scattered, around the property here. But largely, it doesn't matter where you are. You can usually find ants just about anywhere. Whether we're here in Kamloops or whether we're in Midtown Manhattan. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, a new species of ant was actually described from the boulevards lining Broadway in Manhattan. And this is true. It appears that most of its food is being derived from low fructose corn syrup. That is, they're taking advantage of all the food which is being spilled by tourists in the area. So I thought I'd start here in my own backyard, and perhaps just with one sort of initial tale. It doesn't take long, before ants sort of introduce themselves, into your lives in one way or another. But just a few evenings ago, I had a knock on my door right about supper time, and it was a neighbor who had stopped to point out to me that there was a massive pile of ants that were moving along my sidewalk and into my lawn. And she was aware of what my interests were, and she found this large movement of ants to be quite surprising. And she was wondering what was happening. And when I went out to take a look, actually, I was surprised myself. Because while I have seen these ants, and I usually come across them once every couple of years, usually out in open forest in some location, I didn't actually expect to see them turn up on my own property. And what's interesting about these ants is that they elicit a very unusual behavior that is derived from the social structure of ant colonies. And to kind of give you an idea about how unusual, I have here a copy of The Ants, written by William Morton Wheeler at Harvard University in 1910. And if I open this, I can find a description of these ants. And he describes the behaviors of these ants in this particular matter. Okay. I do now refer to these particular ants, which represent an abnormal or perhaps only a temporary state of things. For this behavior seems to tend in ants, as in men, to the degradation of those by whom it is adopted. And it is not impossible that this particular behavior will result in the species eventually finding themselves unable to compete with those which are more self-dependent and have reached a higher plane of civilization. Perhaps we can put a little bit aside the highly sort of structured, paternalistic structure of the description of these ants, but what is Wheeler talking about? He's specifically making a reference to the ants which are found in my front yard. So, when the neighbor dropped by and pointed these out to me, I kind of went out and I put out a camera just to kind of follow what was going on. And sort of, as you see now, you can see this trail of medium-sized ants, which are all moving mostly in a single direction. And the species that we're looking at here is Polyergus mexicanus. And what they're actually engaged in is what we refer to in ant biology as a slave raid. That is, this particular species has left its nest, which is actually in my neighbor's yard, and has trailed along the sidewalk and is attacking another species of ant, Formica neoclara, which is nesting in my lawn. They are killing all of the workers of Formica neoclara that attempt to defend the nest, and then they are walking away with the larvae and the pupae from that Formica nest. Those larvae and those pupae will now be raised within the Polyergus slave-taking nest, and when they become adult worker ants, they will work entirely for the Polyergus species. They are unaware that they are no longer within a nest in which they have their own queen, and they will do all of the foraging and the nest tending and the feeding of the larvae of the slave taker ants. And when these Formica neoclara ants begin to die out, as they will naturally do, the Polyergus slave taker ants will need to initiate additional slave raids. And so when the slave numbers begin to decline, the Polyergus ants will locate another Formica neoclara or related species of ant, and they will attack it and once again carry off their young to allow to be raised as slaves within their own nest. Polyergus ants, when you take a look at their mandibles, are capable of really doing only two things. They're capable of wrapping these sickle-shaped mandibles around the oval bodies of larvae and pupae and carrying them back to the nest, or they're capable of punching through the armor of defending ant species. They're incapable of feeding themselves. They're entirely dependent upon the slave ants for all of their food and to actually take care of their own young. So let's take a look around, and having sort of introduced one of the more unusual ant species that we have in British Columbia, let's talk about what ant colonies are generally. So let's go out into the forest and let's just kind of take a look at the kind of habitat that we'll find many of our BC ants. Okay, so here we're out in some open forest. I'm actually out near what's known as Stake Lake. It's a cross-country ski area in the winter, and mountain bikers use this during the summer. And we're in an area right now, it's a patch of regenerating forest in about 1,300 meters where we are sort of exactly right now. And while this is a little high, which means that this is generally, often a cool habitat, this open area here is perfect for ants. What ants like the most is heat. With a little bit of moisture. And these areas that we kind of open up like this, the sunlight hits the ground directly and it warms the soil, which enables them to raise their young more rapidly. In these regenerating forests as well, there's a variety of different aged shrubs and trees, which means there's quite a bit of invertebrate prey available here for the ants as well. So there's an abundance of food. So any ants that would be sort of found in this area, this would be a well fought for zone to live in. Now, those general principles of kind of opening up the area, that's true for residential areas as well. Just about everything we do in a residential area is just about perfect for ants. And I say that, because we remove, of course, the forest cover when we put in, subdivisions. We have backyards, that we keep completely open with some shrubs on the sides. And so there's a lot of heat hitting the ground, shrubs that they're going to find other insects like caterpillars and things like that upon. So this is really, residential areas are really excellent, for ant species. And so everybody sees them around their homes, and they're quite normal. So what are ants? Ants, they evolved within the Hymenopteran group, the bees and wasps, about 150 million years ago. So they've been around for a long time. And what's notable about them that differentiates them from many other types of animals is their high degree of sociality. They are what we actually refer to as being eusocial, in that most members of an ant colony have given up their reproductive rights to one or a few queens within the colony. Those queens are the only ones which are, or queen is the only one which is laying eggs. And the sterile workers are the ones that take care of looking for food, taking care of the nest, grooming the queen, moving the eggs and the larvae and the pupae around inside the nest to make sure the temperatures are just right. So there's a high degree of social coordination within the nest. And so if we're talking about sort of the classic ant colony, what would happen is that we would have virgin winged queens arising within well-established nests that will undergo mating flights at different times of the year depending upon the species. So carpenter ants, for example, tend to go really early in the year because they actually keep their virgin queens and their winged males ready to go as soon as it kind of warms up in the spring. But all of our other species of ants in British Columbia start raising what will become their reproductives in the spring, and they're not ready to go yet. But once you hit about June, then different species start to undergo mating flights at different times. They often look for an unusual meteorological event, most commonly a heat wave, so that they know if they send their reproductives up into the air, that other colonies which are distant from them of the same species are picking up on the same cue, and they can kind of coordinate their mating flights that way. So in the classic ant, the queen will mate once with one of these winged males. The winged males are almost always black. If you saw them by themselves, you might think it's a small wasp of some type. But they mate, and then once they've mated, they drop to the ground, they shed their wings, and then the queen will find a suitable location to initiate a new nest. Hopefully she's going to be lucky and find a patch of ground which is not already being used by other ants. If she doesn't, then she will very quickly die, and the vast majority of these mated queens are going to be killed before they actually establish a nest. So the queens will perhaps produce a small tunnel, or they might move into a bit of woody debris. They will lay eggs, and depending upon the species, they will either feed the larvae that come from those eggs from their own fat reserves, or they might go out and forage for some food themselves in order to assist in raising those young. Most species of ants, the queens will stay inside the nest and they will feed the very first brood entirely on her fat reserve. So the larvae and the pupae will be raised by the queen, and as soon as they then mature into workers, those workers will go out and start foraging, and the queen will no longer engage in any of those activities like nest building and looking for food. Now, all of the ants that are out and about and looking for food and taking care of the nest are actually females, because within ants, they determine their gender based upon whether or not the queen fertilizes the eggs that she produces. So certainly when a colony is beginning, the queen will fertilize all of the eggs that she's producing. They're going to develop into female workers, which are going to establish a nest, bring in the energy that they need for the colony to grow. Once the colony is well established, however, then the queen might start to invest in producing new virgin queens or males, and she'll produce the males simply by not fertilizing the eggs that she is producing. Depending on the species, it might that might happen in the second year after the colony is founded, or it might be 5 years, before they start to produce reproductives. The ant colony is often considered a superorganism. And what I mean by that is that from a biological perspective, it's almost like, in the classic ant colony, it's almost like a physical body which is just broken up into separate pieces that perform sort of different tasks. But there's a high degree of relatedness amongst the workers in a colony. All of those daughters are 3/4 related to each other because of the way that they determine their gender. And the males, interestingly, because they come from unfertilized eggs, are only 1/4 related to the other female workers. Now, when you see ants out and about and they are looking for food, and you might see them dragging a beetle or a caterpillar, towards their nest, those adult workers cannot actually eat that solid food. The mature female workers can only really consume liquids, and that's because of their anatomy. So what do they do with the beetles and the caterpillars, that they're taking in from the surroundings? What they're going to do with them is they're going to feed them to the larvae. And the larvae function essentially as the stomach of the colony. They'll bring in the solid food, they'll break it up, feed the pieces, to the larvae. The larvae can consume and digest those solid pieces. And then the larvae will regurgitate food back to the workers so that they get more protein and other nutrients, that they may not necessarily find when they're out just generally foraging for food. So the larvae within a nest actually function very significantly as the stomach, and that all kind of contributes to that idea of the ant colony being a super organism. So, as I mentioned, in this area here, this is just perfect for ants. Now we're a little high, like I said, 1,300 meters, but in this open area here, it's certainly going to get cold at night. And so what you often find here are that ants will be nesting underneath rocks or underneath or inside woody debris. Virtually all of the rocks right now that maybe are about the size of a football or so and a little smaller, all of those, will have ant colonies beneath them. And the reason for that is that these rocks are exposed to the sun all day, and they are going to hold that heat through most of the night. So if we move over here, for example, here's a piece of woody debris, and I can see that there's some sawdust beneath this woody debris. So I'm pretty confident if I pick this up, I am going to find, an ant colony beneath this. And so here we have a species of wood ant. These are sort of red-black ants in the genus Formica. And you can see that they have, you might be able to see some whitish cocoons which are associated with these. So, and you'll also notice, if you can see this very well, perhaps not, that they come in different sizes. And the fact that we've got some minors and some majors actually tells me that this colony almost certainly only has a single queen, that's coordinating different size classes for this species. So when you see ants that are moving or trailing along a sidewalk or on a patio, and you see different sizes to them, you almost always know you've got a single queen within that colony. Okay. So let me roll this back into place. And if we move over here, so here's another piece of woody debris. And if I pick this one up and take a look underneath, this is a little darker, but you'll see that there are smaller ants. They're skinnier types of ants, and these are ants in the genus Myrmica. And you might notice that these ants are all the same size. We call them monomorphic. And so what does that generally mean? They're all the same size, which means that this colony has multiple queens. It's polygynous. And the multiple queens simply can't coordinate the production of a different size class within the colony. Myrmica ants are very common up at higher elevations, like 1,300 meters, and they're really a very, very common ant in the northern sort of boreal forests of British Columbia. So one of the things that people ask from time to time is that, do ants bite or do they sting? Well, some can do both. The ants that we looked at first, those wood ants underneath the small stump, Those ants don't have a stinger. And in fact, most species of ants in British Columbia lack a stinger. That doesn't mean that they won't bite, using their mandibles. But I've only ever seen a single species in British Columbia ever actually manage to break the skin. And that was a particular species of carpenter ant. That was Camponotus bacinus, which is one of our largest ants in British Columbia. The wood ants that I picked up over there, you'll feel them pinching on your skin, but it's not going to amount to anything more. Now, the Myrmica ants, which I had just looked at a moment ago, the ones that are a little skinnier, those do actually have a stinger. But our native species almost never use the stinger. So I could stick my hand into that nest, it'd swarm all over it. And I would be really quite surprised if any of them actually stung me. It's possible, but it's really not likely. So I'm back home in my own backyard again from our little trip out to the forest. And just as a note, those two species of ants that we looked at up in the forest, the first that was underneath the sort of woody stump debris, I've just identified as Formica aureus, and the other species that was under the flatter stem woody debris was Myrmica incompleta. All right, I haven't talked about the ecological roles of ants and why it is that we're interested in them. Ants in British Columbia have not been studied extensively until I started working on them a number of years ago. There were fewer than 10 publications in all of British Columbia that related to ants primarily. So we do know that ants play important roles in ecosystems. They are a significant component of overall animal biomass, actually, as a consequence of how ubiquitous and common they are. In British Columbia, for example, we do know that ants will consume western spruce budworm. They'll remove the eggs of Douglas fir tussock moth, and they also will take a significant number of forest tent caterpillar. Other studies, which have been looking at defoliation, have shown that they significantly remove caterpillars from trees and reduce defoliation rates considerably. Ants are an important food source for a number of birds. The northern flicker, for example, feeds almost exclusively on ants, and the Williamson sapsucker, which is red listed in British Columbia, feeds its young entirely on ants that it encounters. Bears regularly dig out particularly thatching ant nests, types of wood ants, to utilize for food. And grizzly bears. In one study that I participated with in the grizzly bear populations north of Prince George, it was found that bears were consuming a great quantity of ants. And in fact, they spent more time looking for ants than they did any other form of animal protein. And it was their third most significant component of their diet after berries and roots that they might be digging out. So ants are quite important and quite useful in many ecosystems. What I haven't talked about yet, though, are the invasive ants. And this is a problem which is relatively new for Canada. We've always had a few species of invasive ants that have gotten into buildings and have been moved, presumably by luggage from one place to another. Pharaoh's ant comes to mind, and most pest control operators in the Metro Vancouver area are quite familiar with Pharaoh's ants and the way that they distribute themselves through apartment blocks quite readily, because whenever a colony of Pharaoh's ants, which has multiple queens, is stressed a little bit by the presentations of perhaps some pesticides that a homeowner might be using, the colonies fragment, and different queens and workers go in different directions. And the one colony that was introduced into a wall void, from someone coming back on vacation, has now become 3 or 4 colonies. And as those colonies grow in different locations and homeowners utilize, their own sort of pesticides to control populations that they're fighting in their kitchens, those new colonies fragment again and again and again until entire apartment towers, have chronic infestation levels, with Pharaoh's ants. What's particularly new in Canada are landscape level invasive ant species. So in the last few years. We have known for a while, I should say, that the European fire ant Myrmica rubra has been present in eastern Canada. But I didn't encounter this species in British Columbia until around 2010. Although it was evident after that discovery that this particular invasive species had been around for considerably longer, at least 15 or 20 years, in a number of locations. And once I had done the identification of this ant, I began to receive specimens from quite a number of locations. So the European fire ant, and the one that we seem to have here in British Columbia, seems to have originated in England, almost certainly coming in, perhaps in landscaping materials, soil, that people are transporting from one area to another. And it's become problematic in residential properties. It likes the environment of residential properties quite a lot. Again, the removal, of, say, a forestry canopy cover in order to put in a suburban development allows all of that sunlight to hit the ground, the presence of the shrubs, along the edges and flowers, and irrigation. The European fire ant really likes moisture. And so well-irrigated lawns are absolutely perfect for this ant. What's interesting about this particular species is that since it has been introduced into North America, it has stopped undergoing mating flights. There are a number of reasons why it's possible that this occurred. So when the nests become mature, what happens is that the virgin queens remain in the nest, and males will fly between the nests to fertilize them. And then after fertilization, after mating in the nest, the females will walk to a new nest location, often only 1 or 2 meters away from their original nest. And as a consequence, you get these really high nest densities. They're moved to new locations when people move plants and soil. And so in the Metro Vancouver area and the Fraser Valley, southern Vancouver Island up to Courtenay, we have pockets and patches of European fire ants where they've been introduced through soil and then started to grow from those points of introduction. With the European fire ant, you can get up to 4 colonies per square meter. And this ant is particularly aggressive, and it will sting quite readily, which means that if you have it in your property, it makes it very difficult for anybody to utilize that property. Having backyard barbecues or simply sitting out in the backyard can become problematic. And we have had one case of serious anaphylaxis associated with its stings, although clearly this is quite rare because many people have been stung now by this ant. And we have had a couple of cases, people with quite severe edema associated with the stings. The European fire ant has gotten into botanical gardens. The Van Dusen Botanical Gardens needed to close 2 areas until the fire ant populations were brought under control. It's gotten into equestrian areas where they will occasionally swarm up onto horses and start stinging, causing the horses to suddenly bolt and buck. And it's gotten into parks. Generally, which means that it's difficult for people to spend time. So there are parks in the Lower Mainland, with signs up that recommend that people do not stop walking, which is not the sort of thing that you typically associate with a park. It's usually a place where you actually go, to sort of quietly relax. So the European fire ant has been quite problematic. And to be honest, we still do not have this under control. New populations are turning up each year. And so far, the control methods that I have been working on for this are somewhat labor intensive. And they require a fair bit of commitment by the property owners to eradicate the ant on their property, and require sort of annual surveillance to sort of keep them off. The other ant which has been introduced more recently is what's known as the Roughfire ant, Myrmica scabrinotus. And this ant is less aggressive. It's another species of Myrmica, also a European introduction. It's less aggressive than the European fire ant, and it is undergoing mating flights. which means that it's not forming such high nest densities, which is very much associated with the aggressive behavior of the European fire ant, but it means that it is distributing itself much more widely. So this is an ant that is causing problems, but not as serious a problem as the European fire ant for homeowners, but it's probably noteworthy that the Roughfire ant has established itself quite readily in the grass fields around the runways at Vancouver International Airport. And when it undergoes mating flights, which have a tendency to aggregate at the ends of the runways, which draw in birds, this ant and its mating flights regularly cause the closure of runways at YVR during mating season, which runs from late July into early September. And there have been instances in which runways have been closed 5 times in a single day as a consequence of these mating flights. Another ant which has been introduced and has spread quite rapidly, not nearly as seriously though, is the Pavementat Tetramorium, likely immigrants. The species is still just a little bit uncertain with this. I first found this ant in Tawasin back in 2004, and within a year I was finding or getting samples of this ants from other locations on the campus at UBC and all over Metro Vancouver. It has now sort of spread up through the Fraser Valley, and the Pavementat is now well established here in Kamloops. It's more of a pest species and an annoyance. However, one thing that it does do that neither the Roughfire ant or the European fire ant does is move indoors. So the Pavementat will readily become a household pest, whereas the 2 fire ants will not move into homes, except under extremely strange circumstances. So in the last few years, these introduced species of ant have been a major focus of interest for me because of my familiarity with ants. And I should notice, that besides the issues that they have with people cohabiting with these ants, they can also have a significant impact on the native fauna in the areas where they establish, the European fire ant in particular. So in one study that was done by myself and Ken Nauman at Langara College, we found that where the European fire ant was established, essentially it was the only ant found in that area, except for the presence of 2 other species in very low numbers, both of which were also introduced, but in equivalent habitat fairly close by, in which the fire ant had not yet established. We found up to 15 species of ants in a variety of abundances across those species. So the European fire ant, when it does establish, has quite a profound effect, certainly on the ant fauna, as well as on other invertebrates that are found within the area. So this is again a new problem for Canada. We haven't dealt with these landscape level ant issues, and so we're scrambling, to try to find tools, that can be utilized. To be fair, invasive ants worldwide have been a problem which have confounded efforts at control. Overall, ants really are quite fascinating. Their social structure and their behavioral attributes are endless and complex. I often think that most people who might be birders would prefer to be myrmecologists or people fascinated with ants if only they could readily identify them, so that they sort of understood what species they were looking at and the kind of behavior that's being displayed by the species they're looking at. Most people, for example, would not recognize, of course, a slave run. Many people are not aware that many of our ants are pastoral, in the sense that they are tending aphids, some of which they maintain in their nests over winter. We have in the Gulf Islands a species of Dracula ant, and in that ant, which is a primitive offshoot in a sort of early ant evolution, the larvae never developed the ability to pass food directly by their mouths to the workers. And you'll note I mentioned earlier that larvae are responsible for digesting solid food within nests. So in these colonies of Dracula ants, in order for the food which is given to the larvae to be passed to the workers and the queen, it's necessary for them to actually bite the larvae and cause them to bleed, and the workers, as a consequence, sort of drink the bodily fluids from the bites of the larvae in order to obtain the nutrients that have been passed on to them. So overall, there are absolutely endless fascinating stories, and I could go on for another hour or two about a variety of other species, that we have within British Columbia and some of the interesting things that they do. But that's kind of giving you an introduction. So again, my interests are in overall ant biodiversity. We need to know what species are here, sometimes so that we can sort of predict, what impacts they might have, especially if they are new or moving into new locations. And as well, we need to develop some techniques for controlling some of the invasive species, which are only going to become a more persistent problem in the future. In the meantime, for anybody who has issues with or questions about ants, they can feel free to contact me. I do a fair number of identifications from around the province steadily. And I can always be contacted at the information which is provided with this video. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you.